In the early decades of the 20th century, few names inspired more anger, fear, or resentment than Henry Clay Frick. Newspapers called him ruthless. Workers called him a tyrant. Protesters gathered outside his homes, not to admire them, but to curse the man inside. When Frick died in 1919, many believed his legacy would be forever defined by bloodshed, broken unions, and unchecked industrial power. And yet, something strange happened. More than a century later, thousands of people line up every week to walk through his former New York mansion. They move quietly from room to room. They study paintings, architecture, and gardens with reverence. His name is no longer spoken with outrage, but with cultural respect. The question is not whether Frick changed. He didn't. The question is how history did. This documentary is not about redemption. It is about strategy. It is about how power was transformed into stone, how wealth was converted into permanence, and how architecture became a shield against memory itself. Henry Clay Frick built 3 major estates during his lifetime, each calculated, each deliberate, each designed to say something about who he was and how he wished to be remembered. From an industrial fortress in Pittsburgh, to a secluded summer estate in Newport, and finally to one of the most perfectly preserved mansions ever built in New York City, Frick's homes tell a story that his words never could. They reveal how fear shaped design, how violence funded beauty, and how buildings can outlive reputations. This is the story of how one of America's most hated men built structures that survived an entire era of demolition, and why, unlike so many other Gilded Age palaces, his still stands. If you enjoy deep dive documentaries on Gilded Age power, architecture, and the families who shaped America behind closed doors, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these long-form investigations possible. And if you have insights or questions as we go, leave a comment. I read them all. Now, let's begin. Henry Clay Frick did not arrive in Pittsburgh as a gentleman industrialist, polished by education or lineage. He arrived as a boy shaped by scarcity, ambition, and a precise understanding of how power actually functioned in 19th century America. Born in 1849 on a modest farm in western Pennsylvania, Frick grew up far from the salons and drawing rooms that defined elite society. His family had no political influence, no inherited wealth, and no cultural standing. What they had was proximity to coal, iron, and the emerging industrial economy that would soon reshape the nation. Frick's formal education ended early. By 17, he was finished with school and already focused on work. He showed little interest in intellectual pursuits, philosophy, or the kind of self-fashioning common among men who later styled themselves as patrons of culture. What distinguished Frick was not vision in the abstract, but clarity. He knew exactly what he wanted: control, security, and permanence. And he understood that in industrial America, these things came not from popularity, but from leverage. At 21, Frick borrowed money and entered the coke business. Coke was not glamorous. It was dirty, dangerous, and essential. Processed coal fueled the blast furnaces that produced steel, and steel was becoming the backbone of the American economy. Railroads, bridges, factories, and cities all depended on it. Pittsburgh sat at the center of this transformation, and Frick positioned himself not as an inventor or innovator, but as a supplier who could not be bypassed. He built coke ovens relentlessly, expanding faster than competitors and operating them with ruthless efficiency. Where others hesitated, Frick consolidated. Where rivals struggled, he undercut. By controlling nearly 80% of the coke supply feeding Pittsburgh's steel mills, Frick created a choke point in the industrial system. Anyone who wanted steel needed coke. Anyone who wanted coke needed Frick. This leverage caught the attention of Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was the public face of American industrial optimism, a man who spoke eloquently about progress, opportunity, and the moral responsibilities of wealth. But Carnegie's steel empire required fuel, and Frick controlled that fuel. Their partnership was transactional, not friendly. Carnegie brought vision and public legitimacy. Frick brought discipline, cost control, and an unflinching willingness to extract profit at any human cost necessary. As chairman of Carnegie Steel, Frick became the operational backbone of the enterprise. Where Carnegie avoided conflict, Frick embraced it. Where Carnegie spoke of harmony between labor and capital, Frick enforced submission. By the late 1880s, Frick's income exceeded $1 million a year, a staggering sum that placed him among the richest men in the country. He was not yet 40. With wealth came expectations. The Gilded Age operated under unspoken rules. Money alone was insufficient. To be accepted as powerful, wealth had to be visible, immovable, and architecturally undeniable. A man of Frick's standing was expected to build not merely a house, but a declaration. Residences were social instruments, announcing status as clearly as any corporate title. Frick approached this task the same way he approached business. He studied. He observed what others built, where they built, and how their choices were received. He noted which architectural styles conveyed authority and which invited ridicule. He understood that excess could signal insecurity, while restraint could project confidence. This was not about comfort, it was about messaging. His marriage to Adelaide Howard Childs in 1882 further clarified these dynamics. Adelaide came from a respected Pittsburgh family and possessed the social fluency Frick lacked. She understood the subtleties of status, the importance of presentation, and the quiet distinctions that separated established wealth from upstart fortunes. Their partnership was strategic, but not cold. Adelaide provided legitimacy. Frick provided resources. Together, they planned a residence that would force Pittsburgh society to acknowledge Frick as more than a man who had gotten rich quickly. The location was critical. Frick selected Penn Avenue, the city's most prestigious residential corridor. The address placed him among families whose names carried generational weight. The land itself announced arrival. The house Frick built there, later known as Clayton, was designed in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. This was not a fashionable choice. It was a deliberate one. Richardsonian Romanesque conveyed mass, solidity, and permanence. Thick stone walls, rounded arches, and fortress-like forms suggested endurance rather than elegance. It was architecture that did not ask to be liked. Clayton rose as a statement of control. Indiana limestone and brick formed its exterior. The materials were expensive, heavy, and built to last. Inside, the rooms balanced scale with restraint. This was not a palace meant to dazzle. It was a stronghold meant to impress quietly. Visitors encountered dark wood paneling, a grand but sober staircase, and rooms arranged to communicate substance rather than extravagance. The timing of Clayton's construction coincided with one of the most violent episodes in American labor history. In 1892, Frick moved decisively to break the union at Carnegie's Homestead Steelworks. He surrounded the plant with fencing and barbed wire, installed watchtowers, and prepared for confrontation. When Pinkerton guards were sent in by river, they were met with armed workers. The resulting battle left 10 men dead and dozens wounded. Public opinion turned sharply against Frick. He was no longer merely a hard businessman. He became a symbol of industrial cruelty. 2 weeks later, an anarchist entered his office and shot him twice, stabbing him repeatedly. Frick survived. He returned to work almost immediately. The message was unmistakable. He would not bend. This experience reshaped how Frick viewed his homes. Wealth, he understood, attracted enemies. Residences could no longer be places of openness or display. They needed to be secure. Clayton reflected this reality. Its walls were thick. Its ground floor windows were smaller and positioned higher than typical. Entrances could be secured quickly. These were not aesthetic choices. They were defensive ones. The losses Frick and Adelaide suffered during these years added another layer of complexity to the house. 2 of their children died young, tragedies that left permanent marks on the family. Clayton became a space of contradiction. Public rooms hosted business associates and social obligations, while private floors held grief and silence. The house functioned as both stage and refuge. By the mid-1892s, Clayton had accomplished its purpose. It established Frick as a serious architectural patron and forced Pittsburgh's elite to accept his presence. But it also revealed the limits of what Pittsburgh could offer him. The city that had made his fortune could not erase his reputation. Every room he entered carried the shadow of Homestead. Frick understood then what would define the rest of his life. Buildings could outlast memory. Architecture could do what argument and apology could not. It could impose permanence where opinion shifted. Clayton was only the beginning. What followed would be more calculated, more ambitious, and ultimately more enduring than anything Pittsburgh had seen before. By the time Clayton was complete, Henry Clay Frick had learned an essential lesson about power in America. Wealth could buy land, architects, and materials, but it could not buy absolution. In Pittsburgh, his name was fixed to the Homestead strike as permanently as his house was fixed to Penn Avenue. Every social interaction carried that weight. No matter how solid the stone or how refined the interior, Clayton existed in a city that would never forget who he was or how his fortune had been secured. Frick did not respond to this realization with introspection or regret. He responded with strategy. If reputation could not be reshaped in the place where it was forged, then it needed to be relocated. Geography mattered, context mattered. The same man, in a different setting, could be seen through a different lens. This was not reinvention, it was displacement. For men of Frick's standing in the 1,890 seconds, there was only one place capable of offering that kind of reset: Newport, Rhode Island. Newport was not an industrial city. It produced nothing essential. Its value lay entirely in perception. For decades, it had served as the summer refuge of America's oldest fortunes. Families whose wealth predated railroads and steel gathered there to escape the heat of New York and the moral noise of industrial life. Newport society operated by codes that were rigid, exclusionary, and deeply suspicious of newcomers. Acceptance there did not depend on productivity or innovation. It depended on performance. Frick understood this immediately. Newport could not make him beloved, but it could make him adjacent to legitimacy. It could place him in proximity to families whose names carried cultural weight rather than industrial stain. To participate in Newport society was to signal that one had moved beyond the crude mechanics of money-making and into the realm of leisure, taste, and lineage. In 1899, Frick purchased a property known as Pride's Crossing, just outside Newport's most densely packed mansion district. He paid $295,000, a substantial sum, but modest by the standards of the era's most ostentatious estates. The choice of location was deliberate. Pride's Crossing offered distance. Unlike the crowded spectacle of Bellevue Avenue, where mansions competed for attention, this site allowed for privacy and control. Frick did not want to be seen constantly. He wanted to choose when and how he appeared. He named the estate Eagle Rock. The name itself conveyed authority without ornament. It suggested height, surveillance, and isolation. This was not a cottage, despite Newport's preference for euphemism. Eagle Rock was a fully realized residence, capable of functioning year-round. Frick had no interest in seasonal fragility. Permanence mattered. For the design, Frick selected the Boston firm of Peabody and Stearns, architects with deep experience in Newport and impeccable social credentials. They understood the unspoken requirements of the town. Newport architecture needed to suggest effortlessness. Grandeur had to appear inherited, not purchased. The firm's work blended English country house traditions with American scale, producing residences that felt established rather than aggressive. The resulting house was substantial but restrained. Estimates place it between 30 and 40 rooms, large enough to host Newport's social rituals without challenging the dominance of the Vanderbilt palaces. The exterior was shingle style, a conscious departure from the stone fortress aesthetic of Clayton. Shingle style communicated informality, even when applied to enormous structures. It suggested that wealth was so secure it no longer needed to announce itself loudly. Inside, Eagle Rock was designed for performance. The first floor centered on reception spaces built to accommodate gatherings that followed Newport's strict social choreography. Guests arrived, circulated, were seen, and departed according to expectations that everyone understood, but no one articulated. The living room could hold dozens comfortably. The dining room seated 20. Enough for carefully curated guest lists that balanced ambition with caution. Unlike Clayton, where Frick's library functioned primarily as display, the library at Eagle Rock became operational. Frick conducted business there during summer months, maintaining telegraph connections to Pittsburgh and New York. This was not leisure, it was command relocated. Even in Newport, Frick did not relinquish control. Adelaide's influence at Eagle Rock surpassed her role in Pittsburgh. Newport society was governed less by architecture than by behavior, and Adelaide understood its rhythms. She managed the household with precision, oversaw a staff that swelled beyond 20 during peak season, and orchestrated a social calendar that positioned the Fricks carefully within Newport's hierarchy. Invitations mattered, absences mattered more. The grounds of Eagle Rock extended over 10 acres, landscaped to create layers of visibility and concealment. Formal gardens near the house transitioned into more naturalistic areas toward the edges of the property. Walking paths allowed guests to move through the grounds while maintaining the illusion that the estate existed effortlessly, untouched by labor. This was performance at the landscape scale. Security remained a concern, but it was handled differently than at Clayton. In Newport, fortification needed to be invisible. The layout of Eagle Rock provided clear separations between public entertaining spaces and private family areas. Access points were controlled without appearing restrictive. Distance from the road served as the first line of defense. Frick had learned that obvious security invited attention. Subtlety was more effective. For nearly 2 decades, Eagle Rock served as Frick's summer headquarters. During the social season, it became his primary residence. He traveled as business required, but Newport provided a context in which his industrial past receded slightly into the background. Conversations shifted. The focus moved from labor disputes to art, architecture, and shared acquaintances. But Newport did not offer full acceptance. Old money families tolerated Frick. They interacted with him. They did not fully embrace him. His fortune was too recent, his reputation too severe. No amount of architectural restraint could erase that history entirely. Eagle Rock functioned as a bridge, not a destination. The estate also served a domestic purpose. Frick's surviving children, Helen and Childs, spent their summers there, removed from Pittsburgh's industrial environment. Newport offered space, health, and a version of normalcy that Clayton could not. Both children developed deep attachments to the property, particularly Helen, whose connection to Eagle Rock would endure long after her father's death. As the years passed, Newport itself began to change. The competition among estates intensified. The Breakers, Marble House, and Rosecliff raised the stakes of architectural excess. Marble replaced wood. European palaces were replicated at enormous cost. Frick observed this escalation but did not participate. Eagle Rock had already achieved its purpose. More spectacle would not yield more acceptance. By 1910, Frick's priorities were shifting again. His art collection had grown substantially, outpacing the display capacities of both Clayton and Eagle Rock. More importantly, the center of social gravity was moving. Newport remained significant, but real power consolidated in New York during the winter months. That was where decisions were made, alliances formed, and legacies secured. Frick began spending less time at Eagle Rock. Business kept him increasingly in Manhattan. The estate, once essential, became secondary. In 1917, Frick sold Eagle Rock. The decision was unemotional. The house had done its job. It had provided distance, access, and experience. It had taught him what Newport could and could not offer. Eagle Rock revealed a critical truth Frick could no longer ignore. Acceptance within elite society had limits. There were boundaries architecture alone could not cross. Newport allowed proximity but not transformation. If Frick wanted to control how history remembered him, he would need to build somewhere that mattered more than seasonal society. New York offered that opportunity. Unlike Pittsburgh or Newport, New York was not defined by a single reputation. It absorbed narratives and redistributed them. A man could be condemned in one context and celebrated in another. More importantly, New York offered permanence through institutions. Museums, libraries, and foundations shaped memory in ways private residences never could. Frick did not yet know exactly what form his New York residence would take, but the lessons of Clayton and Eagle Rock were clear. He needed more space for art. He needed absolute control over access. He needed architecture that could function first as a home and later as something more durable. Newport had been rehearsal. Pittsburgh had been foundation. What came next would be definitive. By the time Henry Clay Frick turned his full attention toward New York, the city had already become the ultimate testing ground for wealth and legacy. Fifth Avenue was no longer merely a residential street. It was a proving ground where fortunes were measured not only by size, but by durability. Mansions rose and fell with alarming speed. What survived mattered far more than what dazzled briefly. Frick had watched this cycle carefully. He had seen the early Vanderbilt palaces dominate the avenue with theatrical excess, only to become liabilities within a generation. He had observed how commercial development crept steadily northward, consuming entire blocks of once sacred residential ground. He understood that building in New York required not just money, but foresight. Location, scale, and purpose would determine whether a house endured or disappeared. For years, Frick rented existing mansions along Fifth Avenue while studying his options. He was patient. He waited for the right opportunity, the right parcel of land, and the right moment. He was no longer interested in simply owning a prestigious address. He wanted to control an entire environment. That opportunity arrived in 1913. Frick purchased the entire block front on Fifth Avenue between 71st and 72nd Streets, directly facing Central Park. The acquisition was extraordinary. The plot stretched approximately 150 feet along Fifth Avenue and 200 feet deep, an expanse almost unheard of in Manhattan by that point. The price, $2.45 million, translated to roughly $75 million today, and that was for the land alone. The location was strategic in every sense. It sat far enough north to avoid the commercial invasion that had already erased earlier mansions downtown. It was close enough south to remain within the established social corridor of elite New York. Most importantly, it faced Central Park, guaranteeing unobstructed views and protecting the southern exposure from future development. No tower could rise there. No storefront could replace the landscape. Frick had secured permanence before construction even began. Equally important was what Frick chose not to do. He rejected the architectural trends that had defined the previous generation. He did not want a French chateau dripping with ornament. He did not want Renaissance revival excess or Gothic theatricality. Those styles, he believed, were already aging poorly. They belonged to men who wanted admiration, not endurance. Frick wanted something quieter, heavier, and timeless. More critically, he wanted a building that could outlive him in function, not just form. By this stage in his life, Frick was thinking less about social acceptance and more about historical positioning. He had watched Andrew Carnegie spend his final years distributing his fortune through libraries and institutions, attaching his name to hundreds of buildings across the country. Frick did not want diffusion. He wanted concentration. One building, one name, one place where his legacy would be fixed. From the outset, Frick intended his Fifth Avenue residence to become a public institution after his death. Not immediately, but inevitably. His wife, Adelaide, would live there for the remainder of her life. After that, the house would open to the public as a museum, housing his art collection intact. This requirement shaped every architectural decision that followed. The house needed to function flawlessly as a private residence, yet transition seamlessly into a public gallery. It needed to be grand without intimidation, flexible without fragility, and secure without visible fortification. This was not a typical commission. It was architecture designed for 2 lifetimes. Frick interviewed several architectural firms before selecting Carrere and Hastings, one of the most respected firms in the country. Their design for the New York Public Library had already established them as masters of monumental restraint. Their work conveyed authority without excess, scholarship without pretension. Thomas Hastings, in particular, understood classical proportion at a level few American architects could match. Hastings grasped Frick's intention immediately. This was not a house meant to impress through spectacle. It was meant to feel inevitable, as if it had always belonged there. Classical architecture offered that illusion. It carried no timestamp. It suggested continuity rather than novelty. The proposed design was French neoclassical in inspiration, executed with Beaux-Arts precision. The mansion would rise 3 stories above street level, with a 4th recess behind a balustrade. The proportions were carefully calibrated to balance monumentality with domestic scale. This was not a government building. It needed to read as a home, even as it hinted at institutional purpose. Frick was deeply involved in the planning process. He specified non-negotiable elements. There had to be a picture gallery designed specifically for painting display, not adapted later. There had to be a library that could function both as a private retreat and a future public reading room. There had to be an interior garden court to bring light into the building's core, and there had to be security woven invisibly into the structure. Cost was irrelevant. Frick instructed Hastings to design the building correctly and allow the budget to follow. Estimates quickly exceeded $5 million for construction alone, a staggering sum even by Gilded Age standards. Frick approved without hesitation. Building on Fifth Avenue, however, presented challenges that even Frick's resources could not immediately erase. Zoning regulations, neighborhood objections, and logistical constraints complicated the project. Construction in one of Manhattan's most prestigious districts invited scrutiny. Frick responded the only way he knew how. Obstacles were negotiated, compensated, or removed. The project advanced. Adelaide participated in the process, but her influence was more limited than in previous residences. This was Henry's final statement. She focused on ensuring the private quarters would function as a livable home, while the public rooms reflected Henry's ambitions. The division was understood and respected. By late 1913, the plans were complete. Hastings had produced a design that satisfied every requirement. The mansion would be classical without being cold, monumental without being aggressive, and adaptable without compromise. Construction was scheduled to begin in early 1914. The timing was significant. Within months, Europe would descend into war. The Gilded Age was nearing its end, though few recognized it yet. Frick was building one of the last great private palaces in an era that was already turning against such displays. Construction began in April 1914. The exterior was clad in Indiana limestone, the same material Frick had used at Clayton, but refined to an entirely different level. Each block was cut to precise specifications. Joints were nearly invisible. The effect was not assembled stone, but carved mass. The facade stretched nearly 140 feet along Fifth Avenue, commanding presence without ornament. The entrance was deliberately restrained. One central door, no porte-cochere, no secondary entrances signaling hierarchy. This was an invitation-only building, and it announced that fact quietly. Behind the limestone facade, the structure was massively over-engineered. Foundations descended 30 feet below ground. Steel framing exceeded residential requirements by wide margins. Frick insisted the building be capable of surviving centuries, not decades. Everything from the mechanical systems to the roofing materials reflected this obsession with longevity. Windows were custom fabricated with bronze frames, not wood. In some areas, glass was triple glazed to reduce noise from Fifth Avenue. Copper roofing was chosen for its durability and eventual patina. Security features were embedded throughout, invisible but effective. Forced entry would be extraordinarily difficult. By late 1915, the exterior was largely complete. The mansion rose along Fifth Avenue with a confidence that distinguished it immediately from its neighbors. Architectural critics praised its restraint. Newspapers described it as one of the finest residences in New York. But the exterior was only the frame. The interior would take years to complete, and it was there that Frick's true ambition would fully emerge. This was not simply a house to be lived in. It was a setting designed to reshape how wealth, culture, and memory interacted. A private residence built with the soul of a public institution. Frick was nearing the end of his life. He knew it. The urgency was no longer about completion, but about realization. He wanted to walk through the rooms. He wanted to see his collection installed. He wanted proof that his theory was sound. Architecture, he believed, could outlast hatred. And now, stone by stone, that belief was taking physical form on Fifth Avenue. Construction on Fifth Avenue moved forward with a precision that mirrored Henry Clay Frick's own temperament. Every phase was scrutinized, every material questioned, every shortcut rejected. Frick visited the site regularly, often unannounced, walking through unfinished rooms and scaffolding with the same intensity he once applied to steel mills and coke ovens. Contractors learned quickly that delay was tolerated, imperfection was not. This building was not simply being erected, it was being engineered for permanence. Thomas Hastings approached the interior as a problem of balance. The mansion had to function as a lived-in home while anticipating its future as a public institution. That dual purpose shaped every spatial decision. Rooms could not overwhelm visitors, but they could not feel domestic in a way that diminished the art they would eventually contain. The solution lay in proportion rather than ornament. Hastings relied on classical relationships between height, width, and light to create spaces that felt inevitable rather than imposed. The entrance hall set the tone immediately. Unlike the grand staircases favored by many Gilded Age mansions, Frick's entrance was restrained. Limestone walls, marble floors, and a skylight above provided light without drama. This was intentional. The building did not reveal itself all at once. It asked visitors to move inward, to discover, rather than be confronted. The architecture exercised control over perception. From the entrance, the West Gallery unfolded along the length of the mansion. This was the heart of Frick's vision. The gallery was designed specifically for paintings, not adapted after the fact. 19-foot ceilings allowed large canvases to breathe without dwarfing them. Natural light entered from above, filtered and controlled, supplemented by electric lighting calibrated to avoid glare and shadow. Hastings understood that art demanded consistency more than spectacle. The walls were covered in rose-toned damask, a choice calculated to complement gilded frames and warm pigments. The fabric absorbed sound, creating an atmosphere of quiet concentration. Floors of dark oak reflected light subtly, grounding the room without distraction. Seating was placed deliberately to encourage stillness rather than circulation. This was not a space for crowds to pass through quickly. It was a room designed to hold attention. Frick filled the West Gallery with works that signaled both wealth and discernment. Rembrandt, Vermeer, Velázquez, Van Dyck. These were not fashionable acquisitions. They were statements of seriousness. Frick had acquired them methodically over decades, often outbidding European collectors and museums. The gallery was not a showcase of recent purchases. It was a declaration of cultural arrival. The library occupied a privileged position overlooking the garden court. This room mattered deeply to Frick, not because he was an avid reader, but because libraries symbolized intellect and restraint. English oak paneling lined the walls. A marble fireplace anchored the space. Furniture was substantial but not ostentatious. The room conveyed authority without aggression. Importantly, the library was designed to transition into a public reading room after Frick's death. Shelving, lighting, and circulation all anticipated that future. This was architecture thinking ahead, refusing to be trapped by the present. The living hall served as the mansion's social center. This was where guests gathered before dinners, where Adelaide received visitors, where formal interactions occurred without the stiffness of gallery spaces. Renaissance furniture, classical proportions, and carefully placed artworks created an environment that felt cultivated rather than intimidating. An organ stood at one end of the room, less for Frick's enjoyment than for social expectation. Music belonged in houses of this stature, whether or not the owner cared for it. The dining room balanced formality with daily function. It seated 14 comfortably, expandable for larger gatherings. The table and chairs were English oak, chosen for durability and tradition. Lighting was softer here, more intimate. This was not a gallery. It was a working room where meals happened regularly. Frick insisted that the house remain livable, not frozen in display. The second floor was entirely private. Bedrooms for Henry and Adelaide occupied opposite corners, separated by distance as much as walls. Frick's bedroom was notably modest. Comfortable, well-appointed, but restrained. He did not sleep in splendor. He slept in efficiency. Adelaide's suite reflected her tastes more fully. French furniture, fabrics, selected personally, and a private sitting room where she managed household affairs. Even here, the architecture respected hierarchy and separation. Guest rooms filled the remainder of the floor, each distinct yet consistent with the house's overall aesthetic. These rooms were designed for extended stays by the few individuals Frick trusted. Privacy was paramount. Access was controlled. The separation between family, guests, and staff was absolute. The third floor housed additional guest rooms and staff quarters. Servants lived within the mansion but remained unseen. Circulation routes ensured that staff could move efficiently without crossing into family spaces. This was standard for the era, but executed with exceptional rigor. Frick believed order reflected power. Above, the fourth floor contained mechanical systems, storage, and flexible spaces intended for future adaptation. Hastings had learned from Frick's earlier residences that buildings needed to evolve. The fourth floor provided that margin. Nothing about the house was accidental. The most transformative space, however, was the garden court. Hastings designed it from the beginning, though it would not be completed during Frick's lifetime. The court brought light into the center of the building and created an interior world removed from the city. Even unfinished, its potential was clear. It represented Frick's understanding that beauty required contrast. Stone needed greenery, structure needed softness. Materials throughout the mansion were chosen with obsessive care. Marble in galleries for durability and acoustics, hardwood in private rooms for warmth, limestone where solidity mattered. Fabrics where art required neutral backgrounds. Doorways were custom designed for each transition. Bronze hardware replaced brass or iron. Nothing standard was allowed. Everything was made for its place. The electrical system was state-of-the-art, supervised by Edison's company. Lighting could be adjusted room by room. Switches were bronze, matched to door hardware. Wiring was concealed to anticipate future upgrades. Heating systems were centralized and hidden behind architectural screens. Comfort was achieved without visual compromise. Security was everywhere and nowhere. Safes were built into walls, some visible, others hidden. Locks were among the finest available. Doors were solid bronze. Windows were deeply set. The mansion could be secured quickly and completely. Frick's experience with violence and threat informed every decision. By 1917, the interior was nearing completion. Frick was 77. He had when Henry Clay Frick died in December of 1919. The house on Fifth Avenue did not fall silent. It paused. The machinery of daily life slowed, but the building itself continued exactly as it had been designed to function. Adelaide Frick remained in residence, and for more than a decade the mansion existed in a state that was neither fully private nor public, suspended between intention and fulfillment. This liminal period would prove decisive for the building's survival. Adelaide Howard Frick was 61 when her husband died. She had spent nearly 4 decades managing households that functioned as instruments of ambition as much as places of refuge. She understood the meaning of the house better than anyone else alive. Henry had built it with a future purpose, but that future depended entirely on her choices. She could have sold the property. She could have dispersed the collection. She could have retreated quietly and allowed the building to become another Fifth Avenue relic awaiting demolition. Nothing in the law prevented her from doing so. She chose otherwise. For 12 years, Adelaide lived alone in the mansion, preserving it almost exactly as Henry had left it. Paintings remained in place. Furniture was not rearranged. Rooms were used sparingly, deliberately, as if she were safeguarding a fragile equilibrium. This period of stewardship was essential. Had the house changed too quickly, its identity might have blurred. Instead, it aged into readiness. During these years, Fifth Avenue was already changing. One by one, the great mansions were disappearing. Vanderbilt palaces were demolished to make way for apartment towers. Former symbols of dynastic power became cautionary tales of excess and obsolescence. Public taste shifted. The Gilded Age, once celebrated, became suspect. Buildings that had been admired were now criticized as monuments to inequality. The Frick Mansion avoided this fate because it was never perceived as obsolete. Its scale was manageable. Its architecture was restrained. Most importantly, it had a future beyond private ownership. In 1921, Adelaide initiated the first significant architectural change since Henry's death. She commissioned John Russell Pope, one of America's most respected architects, to complete the garden court that Thomas Hastings had envisioned but never realized. Pope's task was delicate. He had to introduce a new space without disturbing the balance Hastings had established. The success of the entire institution would depend on this addition. Pope enclosed the garden court with a glass roof, creating an interior courtyard flooded with natural light. Classical columns framed the space. A central fountain introduced sound and movement. Plants softened the stone. The court became the building's emotional center, a space that bridged domestic intimacy and public openness. It was neither gallery nor room, but something in between. This space transformed the building. It allowed visitors eventually to pause, to breathe, to experience the mansion not as a sequence of objects but as a coherent environment. Pope's work was so sympathetic to Hastings's design that it appeared inevitable, as if it had always been meant to exist. Pope also modified circulation paths subtly, anticipating the needs of future visitors. A private home moves differently than a museum. Rooms designed for small gatherings must accommodate crowds without feeling overwhelmed. Pope addressed this without altering the building's character. The changes were invisible unless one knew where to look. Adelaide approved every decision. Her involvement ensured continuity. She was not creating something new. She was completing something unfinished. When Adelaide died in October of 1931, the mansion entered its final transformation phase. Her death activated the provisions Henry had set into motion more than a decade earlier. The house was no longer a residence. It was now destined to become a public institution. The timing could not have been worse. The Great Depression was deepening. Millions were unemployed. Banks were failing. Public resentment toward industrial wealth was intense. Opening a museum dedicated to the collection of a man associated with labor violence risked backlash. The optics were challenging. The trustees of Frick's estate understood this. They also understood that delay could be fatal. Buildings left unused deteriorated quickly. Momentum mattered. Frick's will had anticipated financial uncertainty. He had established an endowment sufficient to operate the institution independently. This financial insulation was critical. It allowed the transformation to proceed without reliance on unstable public funding. Physical changes to the mansion were minimal. The first-floor galleries remained largely untouched. The second-floor private quarters were converted into offices and storage. The garden court became the central organizing space. Visitor amenities were added cautiously, respecting the building's scale. The goal was preservation, not reinvention. In December of 1935, the Frick collection opened to the public. Admission was initially free. Reservations were required to manage crowds. The response exceeded expectations. Despite economic hardship, visitors came in large numbers. They came not only for the paintings, but for the experience of the house itself. The Frick was unlike any museum New York had seen. The Metropolitan Museum of Art offered encyclopedic breadth. It overwhelmed through scale. The Museum of Modern Art challenged visitors with abstraction and experimentation. The Frick offered something different: intimacy, coherence, calm. Visitors moved through rooms that still felt like a home. Paintings were displayed where they had been lived with, not in cavernous halls. The architecture shaped perception. Art was encountered at human scale. The building did not dominate the collection. It supported it. This balance proved transformative. Paintings that might feel distant or academic elsewhere became immediate. The context mattered. The Frick demonstrated that environment could change interpretation. That insight became central to its identity. Over time, public memory shifted. Henry Clay Frick the man receded. The Frick collection, the institution, advanced. Visitors rarely arrived thinking about Homestead. They arrived thinking about Vermeer, Rembrandt, and the serenity of the garden court. Architecture did what Frick had believed it could do. It reframed the narrative. The mansion's survival through the mid-20th century was not guaranteed. Preservation as a concept was still emerging. Many historic buildings were lost simply because no one thought to save them. The Frick endured because it had already crossed a threshold. It was no longer private property vulnerable to economic pressure. It was a cultural institution protected by law, endowment, and public affection. Additional expansions occurred cautiously. In 1977, an addition provided new gallery space and visitor facilities. Architects worked deliberately to avoid imitation. The new construction deferred to the original mansion, preserving its primacy. The core experience remained unchanged. Helen Clay Frick, Henry and Adelaide's daughter, played a critical role during these decades. Though she never lived in the mansion after her mother's death, she remained deeply involved in its operation. She was vigilant, protective, and uncompromising. Her influence ensured that the institution did not drift from her parents' vision. Continuity mattered. As decades passed, the Frick collection became one of New York's most respected cultural institutions. Visitors returned again and again, drawn by the building as much as the art. The mansion offered something increasingly rare: authenticity. Rooms untouched by modernization, spaces that resisted spectacle, silence in the middle of a city that never stopped moving. The garden court became iconic. Visitors described it as restorative, contemplative, unforgettable. It embodied the success of the transformation, a space conceived by one architect, completed by another, preserved by generations. It represented continuity rather than rupture. By the early 21st century, the Frick faced new challenges. Visitor numbers grew, infrastructure aged, accessibility standards evolved. The institution confronted a familiar dilemma: how to adapt without erasing character. How to change without losing identity. Debate emerged. Some argued for preservation at all costs. Others insisted that survival required evolution. The tension reflected the building's dual nature. It was both a historic house and a functioning museum. Both identities were true. Both demanded consideration. What remained undeniable was the foundation Henry Clay Frick had laid. He had built not merely a residence, but a framework for endurance. The mansion had survived economic collapse, shifting taste, and urban transformation because it had been designed with a future in mind. Architecture had done exactly what Frick intended. The man himself remains morally complex. His fortune was extracted from labor systems that caused suffering. The beauty of the mansion does not erase that reality. It exists alongside it. The Frick collection stands as both a gift and a reminder, a place where cultural enrichment and historical reckoning coexist. That coexistence is what gives the building its power. Long after the mills closed and the strike faded from public consciousness, the mansion remains. Visitors continue to walk through its rooms, often unaware of the full story behind its creation. And yet, the structure still speaks. In stone, proportion, and light, it tells a story of ambition, control, and the belief that permanence could be purchased. Henry Clay Frick wagered that architecture would outlast reputation. So far, he has been right. Waited years for this moment. The mansion had taken over 5 years to build and cost approximately $5 million, not including the land. Total investment exceeded $7 million. The house was exactly what he had envisioned. Frick moved in late in 1919. He lived there for 2 months. On the 2nd of December 1919, Henry Clay Frick died. The man who had built his fortune through confrontation and control did not live long enough to see whether his final strategy would succeed. But the house stood complete, its purpose encoded into every wall and corridor. The question Frick had posed with stone rather than words now awaited its answer. Could architecture outlast hatred? Could beauty soften memory? Could a building rewrite a life? The mansion at 1 East 70th Street had been built to test that belief. By the time the Frick collection entered the modern era, its survival was no longer accidental. It was the result of a chain of decisions made decades earlier, each reinforcing the next. What remained remarkable was not simply that the mansion endured, but that it did so largely intact. While preservationists elsewhere fought to save fragments of the Gilded Age, the Frick offered a complete environment. Walls, floors, furniture, paintings, and light existed together as they had been intended to exist. This completeness changed how the building functioned in public memory. It was no longer grouped mentally with the vanished Vanderbilt palaces or the lost Astor houses. Those structures survived only as photographs and anecdotes, symbols of excess that history had rejected. The Frick survived as experience. People did not imagine it, they walked through it. Fifth Avenue itself transformed beyond recognition. Apartment towers replaced mansions, commercial pressure pushed relentlessly north, property values soared. The logic that had destroyed nearly every private residence on the avenue intensified with each decade. From a purely financial perspective, the land beneath the Frick collection became staggeringly valuable. The temptation to monetize it must have been enormous. That pressure revealed the final brilliance of Frick's strategy. By converting his home into a non-profit cultural institution, he placed it within a protective framework that private residences could never access. Museums are defended by law, public sentiment, and philanthropy. They occupy moral territory that shields them from the market forces that erase homes. Frick had not merely built a mansion, he had embedded it in a system designed to protect it. The operating structure of the Frick collection evolved steadily. What had once been a domestic household became a professional institution. Curators, conservators, educators, security personnel, and administrators replaced servants and personal staff. Yet the building absorbed this transformation without resistance. Hastings had designed flexibility into its bones. Mechanical systems were upgraded, climate control was introduced to protect artworks. Lighting was refined to meet modern standards. All of it was integrated discreetly, preserving the illusion that nothing had changed. The institution's financial model matured as well. The endowment Frick established proved resilient. Carefully managed, it grew over decades, providing stability through recessions, cultural shifts, and changing philanthropic trends. Admission fees, memberships, and donations supplemented the endowment without compromising independence. The museum did not need to chase spectacle or novelty to survive. It relied on depth. This stability allowed the Frick collection to resist pressures that reshaped other museums. It did not expand aggressively. It did not dilute its identity. It refined it. Exhibitions were thoughtful. Acquisitions were selective. The collection grew slowly, always in conversation with Frick's original holdings. This restraint reinforced the institution's coherence. Visitors responded accordingly. Attendance stabilized around hundreds of thousands annually, not millions. The Frick was never meant to absorb crowds at scale. Its intimacy was its defining quality. People returned repeatedly, drawn by familiarity rather than novelty. The building invited revisitation, not consumption. The garden court emerged as the emotional anchor of the experience. Completed after Frick's death, it nevertheless embodied his intentions perfectly. Light filtered through glass onto stone and greenery. Water moved gently at the center. The space offered pause rather than instruction. In a city defined by movement, it provided stillness. This space did something subtle but powerful. It equalized visitors. Wealth, background, education faded in importance. Everyone experienced the same calm. The court softened the edges of Frick's legacy. It did not erase his history, but it reframed the encounter. The building spoke first. Judgment followed, if at all. As the 21st century advanced, debates about the Frick intensified. Infrastructure aged. Accessibility requirements changed. Visitor expectations evolved. The institution faced a familiar preservation dilemma: how to modernize without compromising integrity. Every proposed alteration triggered public scrutiny. The mansion's very success made it fragile. Any change risked backlash. Expansion plans became flashpoints. Supporters argued that adaptation was necessary for survival. Critics warned that any intrusion threatened the building's character. The arguments revealed how deeply the Frick had embedded itself in public consciousness. It was no longer merely a museum. It was a trust. Through these debates, one fact remained constant. The core experience mattered more than any addition. The rooms Hastings designed, the proportions he calculated, the sequence Frick envisioned, these elements formed the institution's heart. As long as they remained intact, the Frick would remain itself. The mansion's location continued to validate Frick's foresight. 71st and 70th Streets remained residential. Central Park protected the southern exposure exactly as Frick had intended. Commercial encroachment stopped where he predicted it would. More than a century later, the logic held. This durability invites reflection on American memory. The Frick collection demonstrates how easily narrative can be reshaped when context changes. The same man once vilified nationally is now associated primarily with beauty and culture. This does not mean history has been corrected. It means it has been edited. The homestead strike still happened. Workers still died. The wealth that funded the mansion was extracted through systems that inflicted real harm. The Frick collection does not negate that history. It coexists with it. The building stands as evidence of both exploitation and aspiration, brutality and refinement. This moral complexity is not a flaw. It is the institution's most honest feature. The Frick does not offer redemption. It offers continuity. It allows visitors to confront the uncomfortable reality that cultural achievement and human suffering have often been intertwined. Henry Clay Frick understood this instinctively. He did not seek forgiveness. He sought endurance. He believed that if he built something beautiful enough, time would soften judgment. Architecture would carry forward what argument could not. The survival of the Frick collection suggests he was largely correct. Millions know the building. Far fewer know the full details of his labor policies. That imbalance is not accidental. It is the outcome Frick designed. And yet, the building also preserves the possibility of inquiry. Nothing about the mansion hides its origins. The story is available to those who seek it. The Frick collection does not silence history. It reframes it within stone walls that demand attention before explanation. 3 residences define Frick's architectural life. Clayton in Pittsburgh asserted arrival and control. Eagle Rock in Newport offered access and rehearsal. 1 East 70th Street in New York delivered permanence. Each responded to a specific need. Each revealed a deeper understanding of how power operates over time. Frick was not unique in building mansions. Dozens of industrialists did the same. What distinguished him was that he planned for survival in a way others did not. He built for institutions, not heirs. He built for transition, not stasis. He built with an understanding that private wealth fades, but public purpose protects. The mansion stands today because it was never meant to remain purely private. It was conceived as a gift delayed, a transformation written into blueprints rather than wills. Frick did not trust sentiment. He trusted structure. As visitors move through the rooms today, they participate in that strategy, whether they realize it or not. They engage with art in a domestic setting preserved against time. They absorb beauty before confronting history. They experience exactly what Frick intended them to experience. The Frick collection remains one of America's great cultural institutions. It educates, calms, and inspires. It also raises difficult questions about the origins of wealth and the power of architecture to shape memory. That tension is not resolved within its walls. It is simply held there, quietly, enduring. Henry Clay Frick built for centuries. And for now, at least, The building is keeping its promise. Walking along Fifth Avenue today, it is difficult to imagine the scale of what has been lost. Where limestone palaces once stood shoulder to shoulder, glass towers and apartment buildings now dominate the skyline. The rhythm of the street has changed completely. What was once a corridor of private power has become a canyon of capital, vertical, and anonymous. In this landscape, the survival of the Frick Mansion feels almost unnatural, as if it slipped through history by accident. But it did not. Its survival was engineered as carefully as its walls. Most of the great Fifth Avenue houses failed for the same reason. They were built to impress contemporaries, not to endure successors. Their scale was theatrical, their maintenance costs were enormous. Their function was narrow. When fortunes fragmented, heirs dispersed, and social customs shifted, those buildings had no second life to assume. They were too large to maintain, too specialized to adapt, and too closely tied to a way of living that vanished almost overnight. The Frick Mansion avoided every one of those traps. Its size was substantial but controlled. 30 rooms, not 100. Its design was classical, not fashionable. Its layout allowed transformation without destruction. Most critically, its purpose extended beyond private pleasure. From the first architectural drawing, the house was conceived as something that could outlive its owner. That single distinction separated it from nearly every other Gilded Age residence in New York. This difference becomes clearer when compared directly to its fallen neighbors. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's massive palace at 57th Street, once the largest private residence in the city, was demolished in 1927, barely 40 years after completion. Its maintenance costs were unsustainable. Its scale made reuse impractical. No institution could absorb it without radical alteration. It had been built as a monument to excess, and excess proved brittle. The Astor mansions disappeared even earlier. Their location doomed them. Built too far downtown, they were swallowed by commercial development as New York's economic center shifted north. Hotels and department stores replaced drawing rooms. Land value outweighed sentiment. The buildings had no defense against profit. Andrew Carnegie's house survived, but only because it was modest by comparison and easily repurposed. It became a museum of design, not because Carnegie planned it that way, but because its scale allowed it. Even then, its survival was never guaranteed. Frick observed all of this. He learned from other men's failures with the same attention he once gave to competitors' balance sheets. The lesson was not aesthetic, it was structural. Buildings that exist solely for private life are vulnerable. Buildings that serve a public function gain protection. That insight shaped every aspect of the mansion on East 70th Street. When the Frick Collection opened in 1935, it did more than display art. It preserved a way of inhabiting space that was already disappearing. Visitors did not simply view paintings. They moved through a domestic environment carefully calibrated to frame them. The experience was immersive in a way purpose-built museums rarely achieve. This distinction has become increasingly important as museum culture has evolved. Many modern institutions prioritize scale, spectacle, and circulation. They are designed to move crowds efficiently, to accommodate blockbuster exhibitions, to function as cultural infrastructure. The Frick resists this logic. Its rooms slow people down. Its proportions demand attention. Its silence feels intentional. This resistance is not accidental, it is architectural. The mansion teaches visitors how to behave without instruction. You lower your voice instinctively. You linger longer than expected. You notice details. The building shapes conduct through proportion and light rather than signage. This effect cannot be replicated easily. It is the result of architecture conceived for living, not display. That quality has made the Frick increasingly rare. As cities densify and cultural institutions grow larger, the experience it offers becomes more valuable precisely because it cannot scale. The Frick does not compete for attention, it holds it. This intimacy also complicates how the institution is perceived. It is impossible to separate the art from the environment in which it is shown. Paintings hang where Frick intended them to hang. Furniture remains where it was used. The boundary between private life and public exhibition is deliberately thin. For some visitors, this creates discomfort. The beauty of the setting invites admiration, while the history behind its creation demands reckoning. That tension is unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable. The Frick does not attempt to sanitize its origins. It allows the contradiction to exist. In that sense, The mansion functions as a document as much as a gallery. It records the values, priorities, and contradictions of the Gilded Age more effectively than any text. You can see how wealth was displayed, how art was used to assert legitimacy, how architecture was employed to signal permanence. You can also sense what is missing: the labor that funded it, the lives disrupted to make it possible. Those absences are part of the story too. Over time, public understanding of the Frick collection has matured. Early visitors may have seen it as a philanthropic gesture, a softened ending to a hard life. Later generations approach it with more skepticism, more context. The institution has adapted accordingly, offering scholarship and interpretation that address Frick's history without diminishing the collection. This balance is delicate. Too much condemnation risks flattening the experience into moral instruction. Too little risks mythologizing exploitation. The Frick's strength lies in its refusal to resolve this tension neatly. It presents the evidence and allows visitors to draw conclusions. That approach mirrors Frick himself. He was not a man who explained or justified his actions. He acted, built, and moved on. His architecture does the same. It asserts rather than argues. The long-term success of this strategy raises uncomfortable questions about how societies remember power. Architecture, when executed at the highest level, does not merely endure physically. It reshapes narrative. It changes what is foregrounded and what recedes. Over time, stone and proportion can become more legible than conflict and suffering. This does not mean history disappears. It means attention shifts. The Frick collection demonstrates this process with unusual clarity. Ask most visitors what they associate with the name Frick, and the answer will be art, gardens, and quiet rooms. The homestead strike exists primarily in academic contexts, not popular memory. This imbalance is not coincidental. It is the outcome Frick anticipated. Yet the building also ensures that his story cannot be told without contradiction. The very permanence he sought invites scrutiny. The mansion has outlived the era that produced it, which means it must now be interpreted through values that did not exist when it was built. That reinterpretation is ongoing and unavoidable. In this way, Frick's wager remains incomplete. Architecture may outlast reputation, but it cannot fully control it. Each generation brings new questions to old buildings. The Frick collection must answer them continually, not through demolition or denial, but through context. The mansion's continued survival suggests that this negotiation has been successful so far. It has avoided becoming a frozen relic. It has also avoided becoming a theme park. It occupies a middle ground that is increasingly difficult to maintain. 3 houses trace this trajectory clearly. Clayton announced power in a city that knew too much. Eagle Rock offered distance and rehearsal in a society that would never fully accept him. 1 East 70th Street delivered endurance by transcending private life altogether. Together, they reveal a man who understood that wealth alone was insufficient. Power required structure, legacy required planning, and memory could be shaped, if not erased, through careful design. Henry Clay Frick did not seek forgiveness. He sought permanence. The mansion he built achieved that goal more effectively than any speech or donation ever could. It remains standing not because he was loved, but because he was strategic. The Frick collection today stands as both achievement and artifact. It offers beauty without innocence, culture without purity, preservation without simplicity. It asks visitors to admire and question at the same time. That complexity is its true legacy. The building endures because it was built to endure. The story it tells continues to evolve because it cannot be closed. In stone, light, and carefully measured space, Henry Clay Frick's final argument still stands, not asking for agreement, only for attention. As the Frick collection moved deeper into the 21st century, it became increasingly clear that the mansion's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability. The very qualities that made it unique, its intimacy, its residential scale, its resistance to spectacle, were the same qualities that limited how it could respond to modern pressures. Visitor expectations evolved. Accessibility standards changed. Climate control, conservation technology, and security systems advanced far beyond what even Hastings's foresight could fully anticipate. The building had been designed to last centuries, but not to stand still. This tension surfaced most visibly in debates over expansion and modernization. The Frick collection was no longer simply preserving a house, it was stewarding a living institution. Artworks required stable environmental conditions. Scholars needed research space. Visitors needed amenities that had not existed when the mansion was built. Every proposed intervention raised the same question: how much change could the building absorb before it stopped being itself? Public reaction to proposed expansions revealed how deeply the mansion had embedded itself in collective imagination. Critics spoke not just of architecture, but of memory. Any alteration was framed as an intrusion into something sacred. Supporters countered that without adaptation, the institution risked stagnation or decline. The arguments echoed those surrounding historic cities themselves: preservation versus relevance, integrity versus survival. What distinguished the Frick from many other institutions facing similar dilemmas was the clarity of its core. No one disputed what mattered most: the original rooms, the sequence Hastings designed, the domestic scale that framed the art. Any change that threatened those elements met immediate resistance. Changes that reinforced them found cautious acceptance. This dynamic reflected the success of Frick's original plan. By building a structure so coherent, so complete, he made its essential qualities unmistakable. Later generations could debate how to protect them precisely because they were so clearly defined. The mansion's ability to withstand these debates rested on more than sentiment. Its governance structure, endowment, and nonprofit status provided insulation against market forces that had erased other historic buildings. It did not need to generate profit from its land. It did not answer to shareholders. It answered to a mission shaped a century earlier. That mission, however, existed within a society that now viewed figures like Frick differently. The term robber baron, once used casually, carried heavier moral weight. Conversations about labor, inequality, and historical accountability grew more prominent. Institutions associated with industrial wealth faced pressure to contextualize their origins honestly. The Frick collection responded cautiously. It did not rebrand itself as a site of reckoning, nor did it ignore the past. Scholarship, exhibitions, and publications increasingly acknowledged the conditions under which the collection was assembled. The narrative expanded without overturning the experience itself. This restraint mattered. The mansion did not become a moral exhibit. It remained what it had always been: a space where beauty and power intersected. Visitors were trusted to hold complexity without instruction. The building offered context through presence rather than proclamation. In this way, the Frick collection mirrored a broader shift in how historic spaces are interpreted. Rather than prescribing conclusions, they present layered evidence. Architecture, art, and history coexist without being flattened into a single message. This approach respects both the intelligence of the visitor and the integrity of the place. The mansion's survival also reshaped how Gilded Age architecture was understood more broadly. For decades, the era's buildings were dismissed as excess made obsolete. The Frick demonstrated that this was not inevitable. Quality, restraint, and foresight mattered. Not all wealth was translated into architecture equally. As preservation movements gained momentum, the Frick became a reference point. It showed what could be saved intact, not reconstructed or simulated. It offered a benchmark against which other lost buildings were measured. In doing so, it deepened awareness of what had vanished and why. This awareness, however, did not romanticize the era. If anything, it sharpened contrast. The Frick collection stood not as an emblem of the Gilded Age as a whole, but as an anomaly within it. Its survival highlighted the fragility of everything else. That fragility extended beyond buildings. The social order that produced the mansion collapsed rapidly after Frick's death. Progressive reforms, labor protections, income taxes, and changing attitudes toward wealth altered the landscape permanently. The world Frick navigated no longer existed by the mid-20th century. Yet the mansion remained a physical artifact of a vanished system. It did not explain that system explicitly. It embodied it. Walking through the Frick today, one senses this disjunction. The calm, measured rooms stand in contrast to the chaos and conflict that defined the era outside their walls. This contrast is not misleading. It is instructive. It reveals how power insulated itself, how wealth created controlled environments where order could be maintained regardless of turmoil beyond. Frick understood this instinctively. His buildings were not expressions of joy or curiosity. They were mechanisms of control. Clayton protected him in Pittsburgh. Eagle Rock distanced him socially. 1 East 70th Street preserved him historically. Seen this way, the mansion is not merely a cultural gift. It is a strategic artifact. Its beauty does not negate its function, it completes it. The endurance of this strategy raises difficult questions about justice and memory. If architecture can soften judgment, what does that mean for historical accountability? Does endurance equal absolution? Or does it simply reflect who had the resources to shape what survived? The Frick collection does not answer these questions. It embodies them. That embodiment is its lasting significance. Visitors who engage deeply with the space often leave with mixed impressions. Admiration tempered by unease, calm paired with reflection. The building does not demand a reaction. It allows one to emerge naturally. This openness is rare in cultural institutions shaped by strong ideological narratives. The Frick's narrative is architectural rather than verbal. It speaks through proportion, material, and sequence. It invites contemplation rather than instruction. In this sense, Henry Clay Frick achieved something paradoxical. By refusing to explain himself, he created a space that encourages explanation. By avoiding overt justification, he allowed inquiry to persist. His mansion survives not as propaganda, but as evidence. That evidence continues to accumulate meaning as time passes. Each generation brings new values, new questions, new sensitivities. The building absorbs them without losing itself. Its core remains unchanged, but its interpretation evolves. This adaptability is perhaps the most important lesson Frick learned and applied. Power that cannot adapt disappears. Architecture that cannot evolve is demolished. The mansion at 1 East 70th Street survives because it was designed for transition, not stasis. Clayton taught Frick about visibility and defense. Eagle Rock taught him about distance and performance. New York taught him about time. Together, these lessons produced a building that outlived him more effectively than any reputation ever could. The mansion does not argue that Frick was right. It argues that he understood how the world works. The Frick collection stands today as proof that strategy can shape memory as powerfully as action. It also stands as a reminder that beauty often carries uncomfortable origins. To appreciate one without acknowledging the other is to misunderstand both. The building does not demand forgiveness, it demands attention, and so it continues to stand on Fifth Avenue, quiet, restrained, and enduring, asking each visitor the same unspoken question Henry Clay Frick asked himself at the end of his life. Not whether one will be remembered, but how. Time has a way of clarifying what ambition alone cannot. As decades passed and generations turned over, the Frick collection settled into a role that no one could have fully predicted in 1919. It became not just a museum, not just a preserved mansion, but a measuring stick. Against it, other institutions were judged. Against it, lost buildings were mourned. Against it, the entire Gilded Age was reconsidered. What survived at 1 East 70th Street was not merely stone and art. What survived was a way of thinking about permanence. Most industrial fortunes of Frick's era fractured quickly. Heirs dispersed. Businesses dissolved or were absorbed. Names once dominant faded into corporate histories and footnotes. The Vanderbilts, whose architectural presence once overwhelmed Fifth Avenue, became cautionary tales of overreach. Their mansions vanished so thoroughly that even their footprints disappeared beneath towers and storefronts. Memory thinned where architecture failed. The Frick did not thin, it concentrated. This concentration reshaped how the public engaged with wealth from the Gilded Age. Instead of encountering it through abstractions or moral lessons, visitors encountered it spatially. They felt it in room proportions, in sightlines, in the weight of doors and the softness of light. The experience bypassed argument and went straight to perception. That is the quiet power of architecture. Unlike text, architecture does not ask permission to influence emotion. It operates directly on the body. It slows movement. It changes posture. It alters sound. Visitors to the Frick collection consistently describe a physical shift when they enter. Noise drops, pace changes, attention sharpens. This is not accidental. It is design functioning exactly as intended. Henry Clay Frick may not have articulated this effect in philosophical terms, but he understood it instinctively. He had seen how buildings commanded behavior in Europe. He had watched how palaces shaped conduct without instruction. He wanted that same authority, stripped of royal symbolism and grounded in American restraint. The result was a building that continues to discipline its audience long after its creator's death. This discipline has had consequences. The Frick collection has resisted trends that transformed other museums into destinations of spectacle. It has not chased record attendance. It has not pursued expansion at any cost. It has not rebranded itself to fit cultural cycles. Instead, it has leaned into what it already is. That decision has protected it, but it has also limited it. The Frick is not everything to everyone. It cannot host massive exhibitions. It cannot absorb unlimited crowds. It does not function as a civic plaza or event space. It remains inward, measured, and selective. In an era that rewards visibility, this restraint is almost radical. The institution's leadership has repeatedly faced pressure to modernize aggressively. Every proposal to expand, reconfigure, or reinterpret the space has forced the same question. Would change enhance the experience, or would it dilute the very quality that makes the Frick irreplaceable? There are no easy answers. Infrastructure ages. Expectations shift. Accessibility is not optional, and yet each solution carries risk. The mansion tolerates adaptation only when it respects hierarchy. The rooms must remain primary. The sequence must remain legible. The building must remain dominant over additions. This has required a level of discipline uncommon in cultural management. Growth is often equated with success. At the Frick, restraint has been the measure of success. That restraint mirrors Frick's own final philosophy. Earlier in his life, he pursued control through expansion. He dominated markets. He eliminated rivals. He pushed relentlessly. In architecture, he learned a different lesson. Excess undermined permanence. What endured was what knew when to stop. This shift is visible when comparing his three major residences. Clayton was heavy, defensive, and assertive. Eagle Rock softened those traits, emphasizing distance and performance. The Fifth Avenue mansion refined them into something quieter and more confident. Each house stripped away what was unnecessary. The final result was not a fortress, but a container. A container for art. A container for memory. A container for contradiction. That contradiction remains central to how the Frick collection is experienced today. It is impossible to walk through the building without sensing both mastery and absence. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The art is undeniable. And yet, the lives that made it possible are largely invisible. Workers appear only indirectly, through the results of their labor. This invisibility is not unique to the Frick. It is a feature of elite architecture everywhere. What makes the Frick different is that its survival forces this invisibility to persist. The building does not vanish and take its questions with it. It remains and accumulates them. In recent decades, scholars and historians have pushed to make those questions more explicit. Labor history, economic inequality, and the mechanics of wealth extraction have entered public discourse more forcefully. Institutions like the Frick Collection are now expected to acknowledge these contexts. The Frick's response has been measured. Rather than reframe itself as a site of critique, it has allowed interpretation to expand around it. Research, publications, and programming have deepened understanding without altering the core experience. The building remains what it is. The conversation around it grows. This approach reflects confidence. The mansion does not need to be defended. Its presence is secure. It can withstand scrutiny because it was built to withstand time. That confidence also reveals something about American culture. The country has long struggled with how to remember figures whose achievements are inseparable from harm. Erasure satisfies moral clarity but sacrifices understanding. Uncritical celebration preserves beauty but distorts truth. The Frick occupies a space between these extremes. It does not ask visitors to admire Henry Clay Frick. It asks them to move through what he built. That distinction matters. By focusing on experience rather than explanation, the building allows multiple readings to coexist. One visitor may feel awe, another may feel discomfort. Both reactions are valid. The architecture accommodates them without resolving them. This openness is rare and fragile. It depends on preservation not just of walls, but of intention. Once a building becomes didactic, it risks becoming dated. Once it becomes purely aesthetic, it risks becoming hollow. The Frick has avoided both fates so far. The future will test this balance again and again. Cities change, audiences change, values change. The Frick collection will continue to face pressure to justify itself, to explain itself, to adapt itself. Its greatest defense remains the same as it has always been. Coherence. Every part of the mansion relates to every other part. The galleries flow logically. The light behaves predictably. The materials age gracefully. The building does not fight itself. That internal harmony gives it resilience. Henry Clay Frick understood harmony as power. Not emotional harmony, but structural harmony. Systems that align endure. Systems that conflict collapse. He applied this thinking to industry, to labor, and ultimately to architecture. The irony is that his most enduring achievement emerged only after he stopped trying to dominate people and focused on dominating time. The mansion at 1 East 70th Street is not beloved because it excuses its creator. It is valued because it works. It functions as a museum, as a house, as a historical artifact, and as a place of reflection. Few buildings manage even one of those roles successfully. Fewer still manage all of them at once. This success complicates easy judgments. It forces acknowledgement that systems capable of producing harm can also produce lasting cultural value. That truth is uncomfortable, but it is honest. The Frick collection does not resolve that discomfort. It preserves it. In doing so, it fulfills the final phase of Frick's ambition. Not to be forgiven, not to be celebrated, but to be unavoidable. As long as the building stands, his story cannot be simplified or erased. It must be engaged with, questioned, and reinterpreted. That engagement is the real legacy of his architecture. Clayton no longer defines him. Eagle Rock has passed into history, but the Fifth Avenue mansion continues to speak, quietly and persistently, long after the man himself fell silent. It stands not as a conclusion, but as a structure that keeps the conversation open. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring form of power any building can possess.